or they ruined healthy business activities. Turning to the management of debt, suddenly the idea of austerity as a way out for the depressed and heavily indebted economies became the dominant priority of the financial leaders of Europe. Those with an interest in history could easily see, of course, could find in this a reminder of the days of the Great Depression of the 1930s, when cutting public expenditure seemed like a solution rather than a problem. This is, of course, where Keynes made his definitive contribution in his classic book, The General Theory, in 1937. Keynes ushered in the basic understanding that demand is important as a determinant of economic activity, that expanding rather than cutting public expenditure may do a much better job of expanding employment and activity in an economy with unused capacity and idle labor. Austerity could do little, since a reduction of public expenditure adds to the inadequacy of private incomes and market demand, thereby tending to put even more people out of work. This is a very quick summary, and of course there is much more to Keynes's theory than that, but this common sense summary for our purpose is perhaps just enough. However, the financial leaders of Europe had a very different reading, different from Keynes and from a great many mainstream economists, of what was needed, and they were not going to budge from their understanding. Since it's quite common these days to blame economists for failing to see the real world, I take this opportunity to note that very few professionally trained economists were persuaded by the direction in which those in charge of European finances decided to take Europe. The European debacle demonstrated, in effect, that you do not need economists to generate a holy mess. And the financial sector can generate its own gory calamity with the greatest of elegance and ease. Further, if the policy of austerity deepened Europe's economic problems, it did not help in the aimed objective of reducing the ratio of debt to GDP to any significant extent, and in fact, many of the cases quite the contrary. If things have started changing over the last few years, even if quite slowly, it's mainly because Europe has now started to pursue a hybrid policy of somewhat weakened fiscal austerity with monetary expansion. If this is a half-hearted gesture towards Keynes, the results are half-hearted too. There's in fact plenty of evidence in the history of the world that indicates that the most effective way of cutting deficit is to resist recession and to combine deficit reduction with rapid economic growth. The huge deficits after the Second World War, and they were really huge, were easily turned, were easily tamed with fast economic growth in the post-war years. And I will come back to this question later on in this brief talk. Something similar happened during the 8 years of Bill Clinton's presidency of the United States, when Clinton began with a huge deficit and ended with none, thanks largely to rapid economic growth. Again, the much-praised reduction of the Swedish budget deficit during 1994-98 occurred in a period of fairly fast growth of GDP. Despite political deadlocks and a largely non-functional Congress, the United States has been, in effect, much smarter than Europe on this occasion in making use of this central understanding. The ratio of deficit to GDP has fallen in the USA thanks to economic growth, which, rather than austerity, is of course the well-tried way of achieving the desired result. Had the policy leaders of Europe, adherents of a peculiarly narrow view of financial priority, allowed more public discussion, rather than taking unilateral decisions in secluded financial rooms and corridors, encouraging no public discussion at all, it is possible that the policy errors could have been prevented through the standard democratic procedure of deliberation, scrutiny, and critique. It is remarkable that this has not happened in the continent, this one, that has given the world the basic ideas of institutional democracy. The big epistemic failure in missing the lessons of the past on revival, deficit reduction, and economic growth is not only a matter of wrong turns taken by the financial leaders, which of course they were, including the European Central Bank in a big way, but also of the democratic deficit in Europe today. It's no consolation that most of the governments in the Eurozone that led the strategy of austerity lost office one after another in public elections that followed. But democracy should be about preventing mistakes through participatory deliberation, rather than about making the heads roll after mistakes have been committed. This is one of the reasons why John Stuart Mill saw democracy as government by discussion, a phrase coined not actually by Mill but Walter Bagehot in Million Lines. And this demands government by discussion, discussion preceding public decisions rather than following them. How is it possible, it has to be asked, for the basic Keynesian insights and analysis, which were standard reading material in pretty much any economics course anywhere in the world, to be so badly lost in the making of European economic policies which imposed austerity? Some of the dominant figures in the financial world have had a long-standing skepticism of the economic relations on which Keynes focused, and which is and that skepticism is to some extent being amended now, with reality checks being made in observations of the penalty of neglecting these Keynesian relations. Mario Draghi, the new head of the European Central Bank, his bold plan, which we have every reason to welcome, to deliver €1 trillion, I emphasize, of quantitative easing, which is very like creating fresh money, with decisive expansionary effect, is a result of that belated recognition, which is slowly changing the European Central Bank, that expansion, with the recognition that expansion rather than contraction is what the economy needs. If failing to understand some basic Keynesian relations is a part of the explanation of what happened, there was also another and more subtle story behind the confounded economics of austerity. There was an odd confusion in policy thinking between the need for institutional reform and the need for austerity in Europe. But they're two quite different things. There can be little doubt that Europe has needed, for quite some time now, many serious institutional reforms, from the avoidance of tax evasion, quite standard in many economies, to the fixing of more reasonable retiring ages, sensible working hours, and the elimination of rigidities in institutional and markets of various kinds, including labor markets. But the real and strong case for institutional reform has to be sharply distinguished from an imagined case for indiscriminate austerity, which does not do anything to change the system while hugely inflicting pain. Through the bundling of the two together as a kind of chemical compound, it became very difficult to advocate reform without simultaneously cutting public expenditure all around. And this did not, of course, serve the cause of reform at all. This point is pretty simple, in fact so simple that I found it surprising how difficult it is to get it across. I have to confess to humbling failure personally in making an impact on the policy makers through my efforts on this, which began in the summer of 2009 in a joint meeting of the World Bank and the OECD. But I've tried not only the Bank and the OECD, but also the European Union Commission, the IMF, the Bank for International Settlement. I've tried to speak to them all with very little success. And now I'm having another go at Charleston Festival, which you may think is rather an eccentric choice, though perhaps less so than my trying out an economic lecture at Woodstock. But here's my effort for what it is worth. An analogy can help to make the point clearer. It is as if a person who is ill and knows what he is ill from asks for an antibiotic and is given a mixed tablet with antibiotic and rat poison. You can have the antibiotic, but not without having the rat poison as well. We were in effect being told that if you want economic reform, then you must also have, along with it, economic austerity. Although there is absolutely no reason whatsoever why the two must be put together as a chemical compound. And this has actually very strong implications for policies being pursued today, even about Greece. For example, having sensible retiring ages, which many European countries do not have, a much-needed institutional reform, is not similar to cutting severely the pensions on which the lives of the working poor may depend, a favorite of austeritarians, if I may coin such a term. The compounding of the two, not least in the demand being made on Greece, had made institutional reform much harder to pursue. Another counterproductive consequence of the policy of imposed austerity and the resulting joblessness for Keynesian reasons has been the loss of productive power and over time the loss of skill as well, resulting from continued unemployment, especially of the young. The rate of youth unemployment is astonishingly high in many European countries today. More than half the young people in Greece have never experienced a single job. The very process of the formation of human capability, on which Adam Smith put emphasis as the real engine of economic success and human progress, has been quite badly mishandled through the tying together of uncalled for austerity, which no country really needed, with necessary reform, which most European countries clearly did need. More than 200 years ago, Adam Smith specified with much clarity in The Wealth of Nations how to judge the good functioning of a well-run economy. Good political economy, Smith said, had to have two distinct objects. I continue quoting Smith. First, to provide a plentiful revenue of subsistence for people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such a revenue or subsistence for themselves. And secondly, to supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the public services, unquote. The father of modern economics and the pioneering champion of the market system did not have any doubt why the role of the state fits integrally into the demand of a good society. Public reasoning over generations has increasingly vindicated and supported Adam Smith's broad vision. There's good reason to think that we would have done the same today had the open and informed public dialogue been given a proper chance, rather than being ruled out by the alleged superiority of the judgments of the financial leaders with their breathtakingly narrow view of human society and human economy and a basic lack of interest in the demands of a deliberative democracy. I turn now to the postponed question about the British elections and what they tell us. It's certainly true that the policy of austerity has been advertised as the reason behind the comparative success of the British economy. This comparison with the numbers that are quoted is, however, with Europe, which had been, of course, in a bigger hole than Britain, with a more vigorous imposition of austerity, particularly in some countries. Greece is, of course, the extreme example there. The relatively more positive experience of growth in recent years does not make Britain's overall experience of growth over the period of austerity at all impressive. If we look beyond Europe and then make the comparison, it becomes clear. In terms of the longer haul over the period of 2009 to 2014, with a mixture of pure and hybrid austerity, the price-adjusted GDP per capita rose in the UK only by 9% over that total 5-year run. About similar to what happened in the Eurozone, with some countries collapsing, Germany doing well, making up about the same average as Britain, slightly higher. And very much lower, not to mention most Asian and Latin American countries, but also 16% expansion in the same period in the USA, and even the laggard in Asia, in Japan, 16%. Could the British voters then have missed the real story? That is possible, and I shall come to that possibility presently. But the voting figures do not quite bring out a groundswell of approval in favor of austerity. There is, of course, no question that Labour has had a severely bad election and has lost ground, not just in Scotland, and must rethink its priorities as well as strategies quite radically. But the parties forming the coalition government, Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, had support from more than 59% of the total vote in the election before last, in 2010, that is, before they sprang the surprise of austerity on the British public. And the coalition parties together now have managed to get only around 45% in the recently concluded elections after the experience of austerity. Not quite, I would say, a heady success for the vote-getting ability of austerity for the parties carrying out that policy. The Tories, of course, did get a clear majority of seats on their own and have good reason to celebrate that outcome. But this achievement came only with 37% of the votes. The success is just like that of the, like in my own country in India, the success of the Hindutva-oriented BJP, which got 31% of the ballots, but a very substantial majority of parliamentary seats. So before we start getting our economic theories adjusted from the reading of election results, we have to scrutinize a bit more the message that comes through from the votes and the seats in the constituency-based electoral system that UK, and following UK, India, happen to have. What is not, however, in doubt, and this is really the meat of the conversation, I think, to which Neil Ferguson and others may be pointing, is that the